Om Namah Shivaya, everyone. So hopefully you've taken a look at the examples of classification systems, and now we're going to move into the area of mental disorders. You're going to get a little bit of a history here, just a little bit of the history of different people over the last hundreds, many hundreds of years, 2,000 years, trying to find a system to classify mental disorders. We'll look at a period of frustration that ultimately led to what we now know as the ICD and the DSM-5. So when we classify things, we might be looking at how they're different, how they're similar. Maybe we look at the different functional qualities of what we're classifying. There are many ways to do it. It's a little more challenging in mental disorders, however, because there's nothing there that you can hold. It's not tangible. It's not something that has shape and form. It's something that is manifested through behaviors. Even though mental disorders have been around literally for thousands of years, we're going to go back just to 400 BC. And we're just going to take a few key people over the next many centuries to give you an idea of how people have been trying really all this time to come up with a good system to understand mental disorders. Meet Dr. Hippocrates. Hippocrates was a Greek physician who lived 400 years before the birth of Christ. Hippocrates had a classification of mental disorders that was based upon a biological system. He felt it was about the biology of the body, in particular, an imbalance of fluids in the body. He felt there were three fluids, which he called bile, and these fluids were black, yellow, and phlegm. And if they were out of balance, he hypothesized that that imbalance, whatever it was, resulted in different types of symptoms: mania or manic episodes, melancholy, which is like depression, insanity, disobedience, maybe that was more aggressive disorders, paranoia and panic, epilepsy, which would be fits or seizures, and hysteria. So his system was a biological system classifying mental disorders. Now, I'm just giving you an example from different people in history. In fact, many people were coming up with mental disorder classification systems. In 1763, Delacroix was one of them. He had studied plant taxonomy and he followed that system and created four groups of mental disorders. And as you see here, they were hallucinations, morsatates, which is morose or depression, delirium, and anomalies. That means like anomalies, things that didn't fit in the other groups. Those were his four categories. And the symptoms that he witnessed, that he called psychological symptoms, were vomiting, mania, amnesia, which you know is loss of memory, panic, which has to do with anxiety and fear, insomnia, and, this is interesting, the uncontrollable impulse to dance. Let's go now to the 1800s. Dr. Philip Pinel. Of course, he wasn't the only one, but he's an interesting example. He also had a classification based upon four groupings: melancholia, mania, dementia, and idiotism. He has an interesting story. He was a medical doctor, and a good friend of his had become ill with depression. That gentleman was put into a psychiatric hospital where he became worse. He became somewhat manic and maybe even psychotic and eventually committed suicide. This really caused a lot of heartache in Dr. Pinel, and he was upset. He felt mismanagement in the hospital system had caused his friend's suicide. He took this adversity and used it for good. He became very motivated to learn as much as he could about mental disorders. He started working in mental hospitals, and along with a former patient who had gotten better, they started transforming the system of treatment. Before then, people would be chained, people would be beaten, all sorts of awful things would happen, drilling in the skull to release pressure. And he changed all of this and brought a humanitarian approach to the treatment of people with mental disorders. It was really a wonderful thing, and he is well known for that even today. In the early 1900s, Dr. Kraepelin took a unique turn in the direction of mental classifications, and he came up with a disease model. His model and those of others also included looking at the genetic makeup of a person, what's happening in the brain, but he also included, interestingly, awareness and consciousness of people. Now, I could have made a list of at least 50 different people just to show you all the other people who were trying to come up with different classification systems. Now, why would this happen? It's because, remember, back then there was no internet system. The communication systems were more primitive, not like what we have today. People could write and did write about their discoveries, but it took time for books and papers to get circulated to different countries. It was a much slower system. So they may not have had any idea that others were also working on the same thing that they were working on. Now, what I really want you to understand from this historical, very, very brief historical presentation is that there were so many different classification systems that people were trying to develop in order to try to understand mental disorders. And by the 1950s, this led to a lot of frustration, a lot of skepticism, which is like doubt. Do we really know what we're doing? There was no unitary system. Different people from different countries were all proposing different ways to understand mental disorders. It was a big challenge. And every single system had its own unique way, and yet all of them lacked diagnostic precision. In other words, they didn't have the clarity to be able to diagnose a specific syndrome. They also were not able to guide the prognosis or the outcome of a disorder. And no one had a system that had enough understanding of mental disorders that we would actually know what kind of therapy to do and what the likely outcome of the therapy would be. So this was a time of frustration. And when there's a period of frustration, it often leads to people finally opening up with a new system. And that's what happened. Now, again, remember, because this is so different from your world today, our world today, back then there was no common communication system, no internet, no long distance phoning. Everything was done through conferences and journals. The information took a long time to get around. Even though everyone was seeing different forms of mental distress, everyone was identifying different systems and trying to make sense of them, this was the common goal. Everyone wanted to make sense of mental disorders. Everyone wanted to understand some order from them. And then two major breakthroughs happened. First, in the United States, there was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders that was published for the first time in 1952. This book had taken all the experts that they could find from different places and brought them together, and they came up with a common understanding for the initial version of this book of different mental disorders. They came up with a very specific classification system, and it was research driven. They did research to try to understand what are you seeing in this person? What are we seeing in this person? They would film people. And years later, another 30 years went by when the ICD also came into existence, which was another into existence. It was another international collective approach to try to understand mental and behavioral disorders. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is the organization that has sponsored the ICD. And the APA is the American Psychiatric Association, which is the association that has come up with the DSM. Both of these books, the DSM and ICD, are the globally most highly accepted and respected books related to documentation and classification of mental disorders. Now they're starting to bring their work together. They're learning from each other. They have explicit diagnostic criteria, and their work is research driven. And we can talk about this in class, but for example, they'll interview a patient being seen by a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and then that video will be watched by different experts, and they will rate it to see if they're all seeing the same symptoms and coming up with the same disorder. So this is one form of research. And they also, the WHO and APA have made assessment instruments to look at mental disorders, personality disorder assessments. And by now, both versions are pretty good. Let's summarize what we just looked at. First, we started to try to understand a little bit of the history of attempts of different people from different countries trying to classify, organize, and understand mental disorders. It was a very difficult task. So many people were involved with so many different systems that by the time the 1950s came around, we could say we can call that a period of frustration, because these systems were not really coming together. There was no consistency in how people saw particular sets of symptoms. And then we come into the combined efforts of experts coming together and forming a system that was unified, that began to recognize particular clusters of symptoms for particular disorders. And there were two efforts and two manuals created from this. One effort was from the APA, who created the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the other was from the WHO, the World Health Organization, who created the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day.